Welcome to the Contagious Code Podcast, where we dive deep into code, learn practical skills, celebrate the beauty of engineering, and eliminate imposter syndrome. I'm Tejas Kumar, and I've been building on the web for over 20 years at places like Vercel, Spotify, Zeta, and more. Today, my guest is Matt Pocock, a TypeScript educator full-time who has created the course Total TypeScript and more. Needless to say, our discussion today is a deep dive on TypeScript. What is TypeScript? How do you get the most out of TypeScript? And we go pretty deep into some of the parts of TypeScript that, frankly, most developers have never heard of. We talk about the nuance between TS ignore and TS expect error. We talk about what makes TypeScript unique, and we unlock levels of optimization in TypeScript that, frankly, a lot of folks just don't know is possible. So it's a true deep dive. We also talk about Matt's meteoric rise as a creator. Matt just came out of nowhere and then worked at Stately on XState, then Vercel. And we go through that whole career for anyone interested in the career side of it alongside the code. There's definitely something for everyone, whether you're interested in TypeScript and how it works on the inside, how to get the most out of TypeScript on your team today, or how to grow as an educator and content creator. All of that is covered in this episode. Now, I'd like to offer this to all of you listening and watching at zero cost. The way I can do that is through sponsors and partners, because this is very much separate to my day job. Let's take a moment to acknowledge them. The Contagious Code podcast is sponsored by Code Crafters. Code Crafters teaches you how to code in a way very similar to me, meaning they have you pick a programming language, so Python, JavaScript, Java, and they have you pick a tool like Redis or Docker or Git. And what you do is you build the tool using the language from scratch, and they guide you along the way. By doing this, you get better at the language you choose and also the tool, because you literally rebuild it. It's an excellent tool for anyone willing to upskill their language or tool knowledge. And they have a generous free tier, but if you use the link in the description, that's tej.as/codecrafters, you can get up to 40% off. An absolutely great deal. The Contagious Code podcast is also partnered with React Africa and React Brussels. These are two conferences organized by the Belgium JS community, and we're giving away one free ticket for each. If you'd like to enter a raffle to win a ticket to the conference, just share this episode on social media, say you'd like to win, and that's it. You'll enter a raffle. Now, it's worth noting that you win a ticket to the conference, not a plane ticket to get there. So if you're living near the conference, this is great. Otherwise, you'll probably have to make your own travel arrangements. This is a truly exceptional episode with Matt, and I'm so happy you joined us. Without further ado, here's my conversation with Matt Pocock. Matt Pocock, such a pleasure having you on the Contagious Code podcast.
I'm excited to be here, man. I'm excited. This has been in my diary for a little while, so I've been raring to go. Can't wait.
Yeah, same. From ever since we first met at JSConf Budapest, there's so much I wanted to unpack, particularly around your sort of astronomic rise to prominence in the TypeScript space. TypeScript itself isn't very new, as we'll discuss, but there's a lot to cover. So before we get into it, maybe we can do a short introduction to yourself, and then we'll just dive into TypeScript. And once we exhaust interesting TypeScript topics, we can talk more about the community side of things.
Sounds cool. So I guess an intro to me is that I am a full-time educator working basically on TypeScript full-time. I have a course called Total TypeScript and a book called Total TypeScript Essentials. And I've really, for the last, since about February 2022, been doing this full-time. I used to work at Vercel, like yourself, so I was there for about 3 months. I was at a company called Stately before that as a developer. And I kind of got my break into doing this stuff through XState. XState was kind of my first love, the way I really got involved in the community. And from there, we had a lot of complicated TypeScript issues inside XState, which got me really interested in TypeScript and started posting more about TypeScript online, telling people about it. I mean, people knew about it already, but there was this hunger, I think, to learn the more advanced parts of TypeScript that I think maybe people weren't focusing on, and I tried to hone in on that. And that has meant I'm now full-time doing this. I can, this is my life. I teach courses. I have a course online. I go to companies and do workshops and that kind of thing. And before I was a coding teacher, I suppose, I was a singing teacher, somewhat like yourself, Tejas. So we have this odd kind of shared background that I didn't know until I met you. So I'm super excited to talk about that as well. And so marrying up the coding side and the teaching side has been really, really fun over the last couple of years. And that's kind of where I've landed.
This is why I feel like this episode is so special, because you and I are really two sides of a very similar coin, right?
Yeah.
The education. I also was a singing teacher, but I also was a teacher, and now
Yeah.
a lot of my work is almost half teaching, half research, and in the research there's some engineering. So fantastic. Well, thank you for that introduction. I think there's a lot we can cover, but since you're so closely associated with TypeScript, for the listeners, let's talk a little bit about TypeScript. Specifically, let's start like at the very beginning and then dive deep. What is TypeScript? Why is it useful?
Okay. It's a really good question. It's a question that I've come around to answering in different ways throughout the last couple of years. And I think the best answer for what is TypeScript is that it's a way of making your IDE, your integrated development environments, whether that's VS Code, whether that's NeoVim, whatever you're using, more powerful. It's a way of making the code or the tools you use to code more powerful. And the way it does that is that it gives you things like autocomplete. It gives you errors inside your IDE, little red squiggly lines when you're writing, to make you think, oh, maybe I didn't mean that, or maybe my code isn't doing what I think it's doing, and various things like that. And the way it does that, like if you think about JavaScript, which is what TypeScript kind of is built to compile to, TypeScript is built to make working with JavaScript easier. What TypeScript is doing is it needs to understand more about your code. JavaScript doesn't have any kind of concept of types, right? So it's completely dynamic. Whereas what TypeScript does is it needs to provide these cool features like autocomplete and errors. It needs to understand your code at a deeper level. And so to do that, it needs types. And so it adds some syntax on top of JavaScript to make those things that you want in your IDE even possible. So like TypeScript's origins is really interesting. They actually sort of like initially were really inspired by C# because people were taking C# code and compiling it down into JavaScript. This is like 11 years ago, in order to make it possible for them to work in JavaScript on big applications, because JavaScript was so hard to work on. Because, I mean, you probably have experience working in JavaScript apps like I do. It was pretty grim like 5 or 10 years ago when you were working on that stuff, right?
Yeah. And so what I'm hearing is TypeScript enhances your IDE to give you more actionable insight into JavaScript. I love this definition, and I've never heard it before, but I think it's super applicable. But I think it's also worth mentioning that there's benefits outside the IDE, right? For example, your build, your compile steps, etc. Like it prevents you from shipping unsafe code. You mentioned something interesting. You mentioned JavaScript. So TypeScript was made to compile to JavaScript. And it has the concept of types, hence the name TypeScript. Again, starting at the very beginning, but we will dive deeper. What are types?
Yeah.
Why is it the name of the language? And what do we mean by JavaScript has no types?
Yeah, so if you think about like a JavaScript function, you write a function. In fact, you write any function in JavaScript. Let's say it's just adds two numbers together. You don't necessarily need to pass that function numbers. You imagine there are it takes two arguments, right? There's like an A and a B, and so you've got A and B as the parameters of that function. You can pass it 4 arguments if you want to. You can pass it 10 arguments. You can pass it an array. You can pass it no arguments if you want to. And you'll only find out about that when you run your code. And that's quite different from other languages, actually, because other languages that use types to kind of influence the runtime, what they do is they won't let you pass things that aren't numbers into those parameters, right? They just won't let you do it. And if you try to compile your program, in other words, turn your program into machine code, it won't let you do it because it just sees that that's an incorrect assumption that you're making. And so TypeScript, what it does, like if we think of a type is really just a description of what you want your program to do, right? Or a behavior within your program, a constraint within your program that you want the developers using your code or your code itself to conform to. So it's kind of a contract that you have to meet. And so in TypeScript, you have this add function, A and B, and you basically write out the contract for what your function needs in order to be called correctly. So A number and B number, because you've got numbers in JavaScript instead of ints and floats. So that's kind of what a type is, really. It's just sort of creating a constraint within your program. And because like JavaScript, like TypeScript still compiles to JavaScript at the end of the day. You have a TS file and it has some types in, but then you run TypeScript on it, or the TypeScript CLI, and it turns it into JavaScript. And so it turns it into JavaScript. That means it strips out all the types. So at runtime, confusingly, you're not going to have that sort of type inference there, or you're not going to have that necessary confidence that your types are doing exactly what you want them to. But you can be pretty confident because TypeScript basically checks your program for you, checks that you're calling your functions in the right way, and it means that when you actually run your code at runtime, it's doing pretty much what you think it's going to. And you can be a lot more confident because your types are contracts that make sure your code is called correctly.
Would it be fair to say that both JavaScript and TypeScript have like types? Because as you mentioned, in JavaScript, you have like numbers. But the difference is with TypeScript, the types are known ahead of time. They're not inferred like when you call a function. So you mentioned this function that takes a sum of two numbers. I love your use of the terms parameters and arguments, by the way. This is so cool. And we have an episode with Josh Goldberg, also TypeScript expert, who makes this distinction as well. Anyway, but in JavaScript, you don't know if you're passing in a number, a string, a Boolean, an undefined until it's run. But in TypeScript, so it's both have types. It's just a question of when the types are essentially validated, right? And TypeScript does it ahead of time. Is that a fair? Okay, that's.
Yeah, I think that's good. And you can think of there being like two feedback loops, right? There is the JavaScript feedback loop. And the JavaScript feedback loop means you have to basically, you write your code in the browser over here, and then you run it in the browser. And if it's like on the third stage of a multi-step form or something, that running in the browser can often take a little bit of time.
Yeah.
Or let's say run it in Node or run it in wherever you're running it. And so you have this feedback loop. And that's constant, right? That's in both JavaScript and TypeScript. But in TypeScript, you have a shorter feedback loop, which is you have the feedback loop inside your IDE.
Beautiful.
And this is the compile step. JavaScript doesn't have a compile step. There's no such thing apart from, maybe like linting or something, ESLint might help somewhat. But really, TypeScript knows so much more about your program because it has all of these contracts and types in here to help it out. And so it's got this much shorter feedback loop. So you can code actually for much longer inside your IDE before needing to check it in the browser.
Right.
And so there's this concept of like, does TypeScript make you slower? Does TypeScript make you slower? No, it introduces a feedback loop which is much shorter. You don't need to tab over. And so once you're confident with working with these types, then you can actually work, I think, much faster than in JavaScript.
I love that. I love that whole tale of two feedback loops. And that's been my experience as well. Like with TypeScript, I find myself writing a lot of code with the shorter feedback loop. And then when I go check it in the runtime, either the browser or Node, it just works. And it's this magical feeling where like, oh my gosh, it just works the first time.
It feels so good. And often I get the same feeling from like CSS as well. Sometimes you're working on CSS, there's this constant feedback loop having to jump back and forth. Hot module reload, things like that make it easier. But when you're working with something like Tailwind or like something where you understand the code a little bit more, there's more kind of bigger building blocks for you to work on, you get this same feeling.
Yeah.
And so, I know exactly that feeling and it's great.
Incredible. So if we then extrapolate the basic fundamental concepts of TypeScript, it's this. And I want to say it to you, and I want you to correct me where I'm wrong. This is a thing we do on the podcast a lot, where I say things that maybe aren't altogether there, and the expert corrects me. And in the process, we all learn, including the listeners, right? So TypeScript is a language that compiles to JavaScript that is actually the same as JavaScript, except with explicit types that are known ahead of time. And because the language lends itself to types being known ahead of time, there can be something watching your code in an IDE. This is like the TypeScript language server that will infer what you're trying to do, and this short and allows for this short feedback loop where it will just give you red squigglies and tell you this is not going to work. And so you use that shorter feedback loop to make something that this thing that's watching your TypeScript says is fine, language server, whatever it may be, and then you save it, you check it in the runtime, the browser, Node, whatever it may be, and then it just works. And this is sort of the main reason that TypeScript exists, and this is indeed what TypeScript is. How far or close to something of an ideal description would you say that is?
Yeah, that's pretty good. I think you can think of TypeScript as being like 3 or 4 separate things. And if it was normal, like if this was being run by like OSS or not being run by such a coordinated team at Microsoft, These would all be like completely different packages, let's say. So let's say imagine someone came up with a language that was called TypeScript, right? This is the language itself. Then you might have someone else would build like a CLI on top of that language to compile that language down to JavaScript. And then someone else would build a separate thing, which is like a server that sits in your IDE that checks whether your TypeScript code is right. And so there are these three separate things. There is the language, there is the CLI, and then there is the language server that sits in your IDE. But because they're all integrated, they're all built by the same kind of like 7 or 8 people at Microsoft, then this is all what we call TypeScript. So there's TypeScript the language, TypeScript the CLI, which can be run, by the way, it can be run just in your IDE. It doesn't have to turn TypeScript files into JavaScript. It can also just be used to check your code. If you think of like, oh, this is good. I've got a really good metaphor now. TypeScript itself is like the English language. You've got your teacher sitting over your shoulder when you're coding, giving you little red squiggly marks saying, oh, no, you got this wrong. Maybe you didn't get that right. And then at the end of the day, you can turn your code into your English teacher as like an essay that you want to be marked, and it will give you little marks on your entire project. Not bad, right? That's pretty good. So there's these three things are what make up what we call TypeScript.
Interesting. I love that. So it's sort of like so I've been in the AI space a lot recently, and I think some of the confusion among newcomers is because everything has the same name. Is this TypeScript?
Yeah.
Yes. Is that TypeScript? Yeah. And this is kind of like in the AI world, we have Google with these Gemini models, which it's the name of the model, it's the name of the API, it's the name of everything. And so like, what are you talking about? Interesting. So I love this. So it's really a three-headed beast. Have you seen attempts in the wild for people to sort of create like almost like a makeshift bare bones TypeScript by chaining a bunch of JavaScript validations together? Because you mentioned a CLI to compile, a language server, and a language server, a CLI, and of course the language itself, right? Yeah. So JavaScript, we have the language, we have ESLint, which sort of kind of does what TypeScript does. And of course, ESLint also has a language server by way of its IDE extension. If we compare the tool chains, can we get similar safety guarantees and maybe that second faster feedback loop without TypeScript with just chaining together tools in JavaScript?
Such a good question. So the comparison between TypeScript and ESLint is really good, because if we think of ESLint, what it's really doing is it's running on a single file, right? It's a single file transpilation tool. What it does is it looks at one single file in your IDE, right? The file that you usually have open, and then it does that, like runs it doesn't run it. It sort of checks all the code. It runs a set of rules against that code that's in the IDE and checks it. And it's doing a similar thing to TypeScript on the surface. Now, what that means is that you can parallelize that work. You can basically run ESLint like over a bunch of different like files in your repository at once, and it will run fairly quickly. ESLint is still relatively slow because it's got lots of custom rules it needs to handle, and it's written in JavaScript, as is TypeScript. But yeah, that's the kind of concept. But TypeScript, instead of just running on single files, it checks your entire project. So it actually, there are lots of things in TypeScript that are on the global scope that affect all files. And so it needs to know kind of, let's say, what version of ECMAScript you're using, whether you can call string.replaceAll or whether you've just got string.replace, for instance. So, for instance, string.replaceAll, that's in ES 2023, whereas string.replace is some earlier version. So it needs to know all of these global things before it can check even a single file. And so TypeScript knows a lot more about your code. It knows so much more, but ESLint can technically run a bit faster. And there are some exceptions to that ESLint rule. There are some ESLint rules that use TypeScript's knowledge to feed into that, but that's the kind of basic idea. And so I can't remember what the original question was, but I hope I've answered something interesting in parallel.
Yeah, no, the question was how comparable is chained together JavaScript tools to the TypeScript set of tools, and it sounds like it's slower, and mainly because it has to go through a bunch of custom tools, and also it cannot know all there is to know about your project holistically like TypeScript can.
Yeah, TypeScript knows the type of everything, and once you know the type of everything, you can make so many more smart judgments about it.
Do we know if ESLint predates TypeScript?
That's a great question. I think it probably does. It makes sense that it does. TypeScript Sorry.
No, go for it.
Well, TypeScript sort of feels like a bolt from the blue, really. It feels like a totally different approach. Whereas ESLint, it feels kind of like a sensible thing that you would do if you, that's sort of a pattern in all languages, really.
Yeah. So this has me wondering, right? Like there was a time in the industry where we thought, okay, ESLint, this is great. This is the best way to ensure I've got safe code that will run all the time. And then Microsoft was like, wait, we have TypeScript because of this thing you mentioned. We're cross compiling C# to the web. We can just use TypeScript. Do you think there will come a day where there's a new novel ideal way to create even safer applications? I don't know, like, do we write everything in Rust and just compile that to JavaScript? Probably not, because it's a different language. But do you think what the shift that happened between ESLint and TypeScript could happen again? And what would that look like?
Yeah, so let's dive deeper into what I was saying before about this. These people basically within Microsoft actually were using this this tool called ScriptSharp. And what ScriptSharp was is you would write your code in C#, a totally different language, and then compile that down into JavaScript. And they basically were asked at Microsoft, could you like productize this? Could you sort of either make your own version or get involved in the OSS of this? Let's actually make this official. Let's make this the way that Microsoft creates JavaScript apps, because it's pretty good. People like it. But they looked at this, and a guy called Steve Luco especially looked at this and thought, this is pretty good, but people don't want to have to learn C# in order to create JavaScript apps. There's so much learning there. It's a huge leap. And people just say, no, I know JavaScript. I just want to do my JavaScript stuff. And so TypeScript's innovation is not just to add types. It's also to make those types and the syntax for them familiar enough to JavaScript developers that they want to, that it's relatively easy to learn. I think the learning curve for TypeScript is maybe, I think, if you're an experienced JavaScript developer, probably a week, 10 days of your time, focused work, you can get productive with TypeScript. Whereas if you were to learn C# or Rust instead, I don't know, that seems like a bigger lift. Yeah. And I'm sure there will be some other innovation in this space. There's got to be something. There's always something. But it's a dual innovation. It's not only adding types to the language, it's making those types consumable to the people who already use the language. And that's, I don't know, that's clever.
Right. So this is TypeScript's real big claim to fame, is that it's actually, if you squint, just JavaScript with just a little bit of annotation here and there.
Exactly. With a little bit of sprinkle on top.
What are some commonly misunderstood TypeScript fundamentals that even experienced developers, I consider myself a pretty experienced TypeScript developer, probably not at your level, I didn't write the book on it, but what are some things that people at my level or around, let's say, intermediate to experienced still don't quite understand about the fundamentals of TypeScript?
Yeah, it's a really good one. Let's compare TypeScript and Flow for a second. Flow is basically, it was at certain points a kind of competitor to TypeScript. It was a basically Meta's like way of saying, okay, let's make our JavaScript apps type safe. And often the syntax between TypeScript and Flow is very, very similar. But there's something that Flow does very differently to TypeScript that I think certain people will admire, actually. And what Flow does is it has exact object types by default. Now, what on earth do I mean by that? Exact object types. Well, an exact object type is, let's say you have an object that you need to pass to a fetch function. It has a URL on it, and then it has an optional timeout, like, that you can pass to it, timeout in milliseconds to time out the function. Now, if you declare that function, you call that function in TypeScript, and you pass it an object, and you say URL, and then you spell timeout with the O capitalized, you spell it wrong or something, then TypeScript will give you an error. It says, okay, you can't pass timeout on this object. Are you sure you didn't mean, spell it correctly? But if you move that object outside of the function call, you put it inside a variable, then you pass it again, and you misspell the object or something like that, or misspell timeout again, then it won't error. It will let you pass an incorrect property. And that's because you can actually add a bunch of stuff to that object. You can add like 1,000 properties, and TypeScript won't complain when you pass them to the object. Now, the reason for that is that TypeScript doesn't really care about excess properties. As long as you pass the required stuff, you pass the URL, it doesn't matter about all the optional stuff. You can pass whatever you want. And so it's very easy to screw that up, actually. It cares about it when you pass the object directly, because it knows then that you probably messed that up. You're not going to reuse that object in certain places.
Right, you're creating that object at that point for that use case, for nothing else.
Exactly. TypeScript would consider that a fresh declaration, a fresh object being passed into that function. Whereas when it's not fresh, when it's just hanging out in a variable above it, then you can add as much as you want. And this is what we would call an open approach to object types. So TypeScript has open objects, whereas Flow would actually error there. Flow would say you can only pass properties to this function that it knows about. And you've probably got that wrong because you passed timeout incorrectly. And that is a really interesting decision from TypeScript, because it means that when you're working with any object, that object could contain properties that you don't know about. Could, right? It could have, like, if you have a user object with an ID and a name or whatever, it could have age, roles, things that you don't know exist on it. And TypeScript assumes, I think correctly, that those excess properties are not going to cause errors in your apps. It will probably be fine. But Flow is much more strict about them.
But why do you think TypeScript's assumption is correct? Because, okay, if I was to guess, make an educated guess, I've had cases where, indeed, I've passed objects with extraneous properties to a function that only needed like URL and timeout. But there was, age, gender, location, whatever, on these objects. And indeed, nothing happened. So I can kind of see why you agree with TypeScript's opinion here, but can we maybe play devil's advocate and justify Flow's opinion here? Because maybe you don't know because you haven't worked at Meta on the Flow team, I don't think. But if we were to make an educated guess, what would be the basis for such a decision that Flow would make?
Yeah, so what you get when you have when you have exact property types is that you know for sure which keys are on each object, and it means that you can, when you iterate over those keys, you know exactly what those keys are. So when you call object.keys on an object that is a user of ID and name, you know that those keys are only ever ID and name. Whereas in TypeScript, it's a pretty gnarly setup where object.keys always returns string, or an array of strings, because you don't know exactly what those keys are going to be. Now, TypeScript, I think, made their decision so that I think their decision is actually what most languages do. What most languages do is, let's say you're coming from like an object-oriented setup where you have like an animal class, and then you have a dog class that extends animal that adds a couple of extra methods. Then you have a chihuahua class that extends dog. Technically, you probably want to be able to declare animal as a function parameter and then pass a chihuahua into that slot. You don't want to have an error there where that's happening. And so I think it's a kind of object-oriented influence there that's working on TypeScript. And I think that makes sense given that the creator of C# was really, really involved in the creation of TypeScript as well. So I think that's the influence. And so working with Flow's setup, it can be pretty frustrating to do that. It can be kind of annoying to work in situations like there are kind of upsides and downsides to both of them.
Yeah. And with Flow, you're probably going to over-declare variables, right? Because you'll have one for just that contains just the properties you need, and you'd have another one that maybe spreads more stuff in there. And
Yes.
I don't know the memory impact of all of that. I think it would still be pretty negligible given how optimized JavaScript engines are. But okay, it's more about developer convenience in this case. Interesting. Is there a way to get the behavior of Flow, that is to have more closed object types in TypeScript? What I mean by that is if you assign this function argument that's an object to a variable just above, is there a way to enforce that, okay, this thing is not allowed to contain any more properties in TypeScript?
Not really. No, that's quite a frustrating thing. Yeah, I know. Wow. It goes against one of TypeScript's fundamental assumptions about your code. And so you can, I don't want to say never. There are certain situations where you have, like, let's say, a really good example for this is, let's say you're mapping over a bunch of objects, right? And you have your map function, or no, even better example. And this is one that people run into all the time when you're using useState. So you have useState, and let's say you have an object inside of it. When you call update that piece of state, update user, let's say, and you call it with a function inside of it, then inside that function, when you return stuff from that function, you can pass access properties, which just feels so gross. And that's something I get buzzed on Twitter all the time. It's like, why am I allowed to pass access properties here? It just feels stupid.
Interesting. So there's really no way to clamp down on that and prevent access properties. Because I think of maybe, I don't know, some magic with generics, and you can say if this doesn't extend a specific key, then it's never, or some trickery like this.
There are some... Yeah, I mean, there are some gnarly ways of getting around it, I think, but they just don't feel good, really. And you can tell that TypeScript is forcing you into this open object mode.
Yeah, definitely. And to fight it is to fight your language, and I don't know if that's worth it. It's better to maybe enforce that than in runtime logic, right? We could do something like if object.keys is not equal to this specific array, then warn, or something like that.
Exactly. And this is why a lot of people like validation tools like Zod as well, because this is something that Zod will do. It will actually sort of basically cut out any excess properties that aren't present on the schemas that you declare. And so you declare your schema, and when you go schema.parse, you just take that runtime object, you strip out all the excess keys, and you kind of know what you're working with. And so that can feel pretty good. But yeah, that's I think something that a lot of engineers don't know when they're working with TypeScript, is that these access properties can just appear like wild Pokemon all the time.
Yeah, I didn't know that. That's so cool, man. I love. This is why this podcast is so rewarding. Like, I get immediate value from it, and whoever's listening, whenever they're listening, will probably also get that. Let's talk a little bit about some advanced type system features. Specifically, I want to if I'm a developer and I want to use the type system of TypeScript to create APIs that are self-documented. And so basically just automating all of the documentation using TypeScript's type system. Can I do that? And if yes, how? And I can maybe preface this by sharing a real world example of I did something like this once. So in 2016, 2017, I had a job where we had a design system, a component library. And each thing was a TypeScript component. So you can imagine a button component with interface props, on-click, label, whatever. And we used those interfaces to generate pages for documentation. It was great because we didn't really have to write anything. In fact, what we did was we put comments above each key in the interface so that then when you mouse over in the IDE, you get the description, but also we generated docs from that. And we took it a step further by embedding a lightweight version of the Monaco editor, now just VS Code, in the browser. So you would then have this playground in the documentation with all the type information and so on. So this was 2017. I'm wondering if that's gotten easier over time. And I think if we zoom out on the question a little bit, make it a bit broad, for developers today looking to sort of use TypeScript's type system to create self-documenting APIs, how would they go about that? What's the best way?
Yeah. So
sorry to interrupt. And I think more importantly, should they, or is there still a strong role for fully manual, human written documentation?
Yeah. So I do have quite strong opinions about this, actually. So the ecosystem for doing that stuff, for let's say you take your TypeScript code, which, as you say, you can do all sorts of cool stuff with js.comments in TypeScript code. What you can do is you have an object, let's say, and for this I'm going to use a story that's kind of quite self-congratulatory. I'm going to kind of I'm going to pat myself on the back for a minute. Yeah. So my baby was born in January. And
congrats.
Thank you very much. And what I would do in the first couple of months is I would be up all night, really, or a lot of the night, with him sleeping on me. So that's kind of his thing. He just liked sleeping on me, didn't like sleeping in the bed. And I would need to find something to do during that time, and something that would keep me awake, something that would entertain me. And so what I decided to do, this is something that bugged me for a long time, is that the types for React didn't really have any self-documenting parts to them. So they had sort of brief descriptions. They were pretty gnarly here and there. If you use like React.React node, there was no description inside the code as to what it did. And so what I did was I made like 7 or 8 PRs to the types for React to add comments to them. This is what I was doing at like 3 a.m. or something. Just sat back going, oh, this is what this does.
My goodness.
Yeah, and it was great. And so this got merged, and this is now in React itself. And so the comments that you see there, and there's all sorts of cool stuff like linking to examples, like linking to other types as well that are related as well. There's this whole language of different things you can do inside this JSDoc syntax to annotate types, to annotate object properties, to annotate functions, so that when you mouse over them, when you're working on them, you can actually see them. You can actually like look at them and go, wow, this is really cool. Now, that's awesome, because what that means is that when you're working in your IDE, you can actually look at that stuff and it's observable to you. There are various tools to take that and then kind of like make a documentation site out of it. And those tools, I think like TSDoc does this, those tools I think are not very useful. You get these kind of like cookie cutter API docs sites. I think XState had one. I think various tools have one. And it's kind of just like a readout of what you can see in your IDE, kind of like taking the TypeScript files of your source, or like the declaration files, and then turning those into a site. I never find those very useful. And I often think they can be a blocker or like a reason not to create actual documentation for those functions and APIs, right? Like that's something that can actually happen and be a bit of a danger. And often you find just like cruft all over them, where internal stuff that should never have been documented on the site gets turned into documentation. So I do think that the magic combination is tons and tons of JSDoc comments of real high quality, explaining all of the stuff of what your API should do, and then a really nicely written documentation site to kind of match that up and give proper reasons for that. And of course, you can link between them too. So that is my thinking there. And if you're creating APIs for your team or things like that, you should absolutely be using JSDoc to self-document them, because it's just so nice when a team member can go, I'm not sure how this reusable function works. What is it supposed to do? They can just hover over it, see a usage example.
Right. So there's a place for a complementarianism between handwritten docs and JSDoc. What I heard is the big takeaway is use JSDoc heavily for your functions, for whatever it may be, and then pair that with handwritten documentation. How about interactive playgrounds? I think these are maybe easy to generate with TypeScript. Do you think that's worth the effort? I mean, you are including a lot of client-side JavaScript in your bundle, so it may be slower, but of course, with lazy loading strategies, you could get around them pretty quickly. Is it worth the effort, or do you think with JSDoc and strong types, you maybe don't need them?
Yeah, I think it depends on your target market, right? If it's just like a internal API, let's say, and it's relatively easy to run, and if you're getting value out of those interactive playgrounds, like and you're working on something visual as well that you kind of need to understand how it sort of how it looks when it's written, then yeah, interactive playground makes total sense. But this kind of like just spew out a bunch of TSDoc, stick it on a site somewhere, that'll do for documentation.
Never, yeah.
Hate that.
What's the worst, and by worst I mean like complex type you've ever written, either for work or for teaching, where it's got I'm not gonna say the G word, but it's got type parameters, and it's got the infer keyword, it's got pick and omit and specialized types, and I've seen some really gnarly stuff, as I'm sure many listeners have. What's an example of one that you've written that was necessary to actually solve a real problem, as opposed to just being like, exploratory?
Yeah. I'll give an example of one that I didn't write, but is a very cool story, which is that Mark Erickson, who is the guy behind Redux, or let's say
also
long-term maintainer of Redux, also guest on the podcast, extremely nice man. I just really, really like talking to him. He's such a lovely dude. And he's long-term maintainer of Redux, long-term maintainer of reselect as well. And reselect is kind of like a way of creating memoized selectors for Redux. Essentially, it creates you pass it a bunch of functions, it creates a bunch of functions. It's kind of like you need a lot of complex generic logic to make it work. And this type that he created was basically, you would have a function called createSelect. I can't remember quite all of the details, but you would need to pass it a bunch of functions, and those functions relied on the parameters of other functions that you passed it. And to make all of that work, you could either do this sort of crazy set of function overloads, which would take 200 lines of TypeScript code in order to describe, or you could somehow mush all of those together and create some kind of bit of wizardry to make it work. And he spent about 2 weeks writing this type, like a single type that was about, 400 characters long or something, right? Huge, I think it was actually quite a lot longer than that, actually, like maybe 16 lines long, bunch of different complex TypeScript things used, and it got it working. And an interesting thing that TypeScript itself does is it tests new versions of TypeScript against the entire ecosystem. And they were writing TypeScript 4.9 or something, and they ran the test, tested it against the ecosystem, and a single type broke.
Oh,
and
wow.
it was Mark Erickson's type. in the huge ecosystem of TypeScript stuff, a single type broke. And he was quite proud of this, and so he asked for help. And Anders Heilsberg himself, the creator of C#, fellow at Microsoft, came in and rewrote the type for him, and rewrote it so that it was shorter, much more elegant, ran faster, and still did the same behavior, and was compatible with previous versions of TypeScript and new versions.
Incredible.
So there are wizards and there are
love
wizards.
to,
you know what I mean?
through perhaps your book or other means, be at that level where he just looked at it and he could rewrite it to do, wow, that's incredible.
Yeah. I know, even without all of the domain knowledge from working on Redux for years or creates, you know what I mean? Like all of that stuff just came in, bam.
So incredible. That is so impressive. Okay, so it sounds like there are some complex types out there, but I've seen issues with this, Matt, and I would love to get your input. I've been on teams. I've been an engineering manager on front-end teams where my engineers often require abundantly more time to ship a feature because the types aren't quite right. I don't want to use string here, or rather, I don't want to use object here. I wanted to infer something from a function, and I want to use type parameter. Like they oftentimes want to have like 100% perfect type safety and coverage, to the point where it's detrimental to project timelines when we need it to ship. And I've had a frankly tough time navigating this as an engineering manager. Meaning, do I say, okay, let's just delay the project so you can get your types in order so that it then works more reliably after we ship? Or, look, just put an any on it and ship, and then, and make sure it's like accounted for in application land. You're using Zod, you're using if else type checks, you're using Sentry, everything's, monitored. But ship it now and then fix the types later once we have customers and users, right? So those are the two sort of paths I could take, and it's honestly a stressful fork. It has been for me. What would your advice be there? Is it worth investing in getting your types perfect before you ship, even if it means delays, or is it better to ship and then adjust your types?
So I think you're offering two paths there, and which is either patch it over with an any, or spend the extra time. And I think there is a third path, which is often this kind of like feeling of wanting to get the types right, and landing yourself in complicated situations because you like want to get the types right. Often that's got a deeper root cause, and that deeper root cause is wanting to make your code dry, right? Is wanting to find beautiful abstractions to make sure that your code is working, like to make your code beautiful,
Yeah.
So that you don't repeat yourself multiple times, so that and that's often the reason that generics exist and generic functions exist in TypeScript and this kind of complicated stuff is to create APIs so that we don't need to repeat ourselves so often. Like if you have a fetch function, for instance, when you're fetching multiple stuff from your API, ideally you don't want to have to like manually annotate the types every time you call that fetch function, for instance. You want it to just be inferred. And so you create these kind of crazy abstractions and do all of that stuff. And so I think complex TypeScript comes from complex JavaScript, because TypeScript is just an effort to describe JavaScript. And so if you're writing complicated JavaScript, you probably will need to write complicated TypeScript in order to describe what you're doing. Whereas if you find an opportunity to simplify things, to write dumber code, is you're going to end up needing to write less dumb TypeScript. And so in that situation, like, if you're there already, you do need to have a good sense for when to just use any and move on. Because we're not in the business of writing complicated types, we're in the business of serving users, right? And serving deadlines and cracking on with work. And so often, I think, that's where I would go in that situation, is try to find a way to make the JavaScript that you're writing simpler, and to encourage people to just bung an any on it and find ways to
This is so great.
get
Yeah, so it sounds like try to make your code as beautiful as you can, but if we need to ship tomorrow and you can't do it by tomorrow, then where I was initially just seeing slap an any on and ship, there's actually something you could do before slapping an any on it and shipping, which is, can this be simplified? Can this be decomposed? If this function is doing too much, maybe make smaller functions, type them perfectly and compose them, right? I never thought about this, but this is really cool. That if your types are too complicated, I will actually mark this for a clip and share it on social media. I think it's cool. If your types are too complicated, it's maybe just that your application code is too complicated. And so, awesome.
Absolutely. And often what that means is that your application code is too... So in my book, I have this chapter on derived types. And we can think of this as kind of like... and the distinction here is between derived and decoupled types. Because if you think like... And this is sort of like... goes along with code as well. If we think of like derived types, which is, let's say you have two types, two objects where... this is a really simple example, but you have an object that kind of extends another object. So you have, let's say, this is a good one, where we have an avatar component that has like, I don't know, image URL and the name of the user for the alt text. And then you have a user object in your database. Should those two types be linked? Probably not, right? Because the avatar like component needs to move separately, needs to move in different circles, needs to be flexible enough so that the user object changes, then it doesn't also need to change. So there's that same concept, I think. People really run into that a lot when they try to be too clever with TypeScript. They end up creating these chains of linked types, linked through generic functions they're not even really aware of, that end up making their system really coupled. And so changes in one place need to echo in all sorts of different places. So I think there is an argument for being stupid
and thinking more about the boundaries. How is this going to move through my application? Absolutely love that. You mentioned, as a developer, you need to cultivate a sense of knowing when to use any. So like if I extrapolate this to like video games, in my downtime, I play a lot of Fortnite. In Fortnite, there's this term in video games, in any type of video game, there's this term, especially if it's dependent on other human beings playing online, is game sense. You have to sort of get a feel for your environment, and if it's a shooter, like find cover and like keep thinking about the possibilities. If we liken that to what we're saying here about using any, what I hear you say is as a developer, you just need, it's a feeling thing. You just know now is the time to use any, and now is the time to maybe not. What's the best way for someone to cultivate that sense? Is it just pain, like ship a bunch of any's, feel pain, lose a bunch of money for your company, maybe get fired, and then you learn your lesson? Or is there a shortcut, a hack to cultivate the sense in a healthier way?
Yeah. So I think the first thing you need to do is read my book, of course. I mean, it's free.
We'll put a link to you.
It's just
we'll
online.
Put a link to that in the show notes.
And thank you. Total TypeScript Essentials. Just read it. And the reason I say that is because I try to focus a lot on the mental models of TypeScript, on this game sense idea of getting a feeling for when you're pushing up against a boundary of TypeScript. Like we talked about open object types earlier. Often you will need to force TypeScript a little bit, use an assertion. When you're iterating over objects, for instance, and object keys, and you know that your object will only ever contain these keys, you need to force TypeScript to say that. And it's not just any as well. We're talking about any type of assertion where you have to try to tell the type system that you know more than it. So let's say that you know, for instance, that in your HTML code, there will always be a div with a certain ID, an ID of root, because that's where your React app, client-side rendered, needs to go into, right? You know that. TypeScript can never know that, right? It just doesn't know. And so you need to tell it that when I call document.queryElements, that when I call it with this certain ID, or document.getElement ID, it will never be null, right? It will always be there. Now, is this safe? Is this sensible? Of course it's sensible, because I know more than TypeScript at this moment. But in certain situations, TypeScript knows more than you, right? And it's hard to unpick. Like, the only way you can always know whether you know more than TypeScript is to know TypeScript intimately, right? Is to have been in those battle zones where you... And I still get into these moments when I feel like, it's... Being a TypeScript educator, it's relatively easy to be cocky about your knowledge of TypeScript, and not pay homage to the blue god and just sort of stick any's in various situations and kind of like try and get around it. But I still, sometimes cause myself bugs. And I look back, I had one recently where I just updated a package and caused a few errors. I stuck a few any's on it, and it turned out, yes, upgrading that package did actually cause some issues, you stupid bold man. So, yeah, it's a tricky problem, and it really comes from experience.
Interesting, you say pay homage to the blue god, and you're wearing a blue shirt, and it just struck me, is this the TypeScript color? Is that your thing now? You just wear the...
No, it's not the TypeScript. This is, I think, the only shirt I have that doesn't have baby sex on it.
Well, thanks for coming to the podcast without baby vomit on you. Excellent. Hey, this has been I've learned so much. One final thing that keeps coming up when I teach people TypeScript, and of course I'm nowhere near the level of educator that you are, and I don't have a strong answer for this, so I figure I'd take time and pick your brain and get some on-demand consultation here. You can invoice me after. People, I often suggest to folks, especially early career folks, if you're going to tell TypeScript you know more than it in a sensible way, I've seen a lot of @TSIgnore directives, right? And this is just TypeScript, leave me alone. I know what I'm doing. It's the ultimate TypeScript stop. But I often suggest to folks, no, do TS expect error instead. And then they ask me why. How does it work differently than TSIgnore? And I have no idea. I could look into it. I could learn, but I figure I have you here.
Sounds good. There's a whole section on this in my book as well, and this I have strong opinions here too. So what TSIgnore does is it's kind of like ESLint disable next line, right? Which is it takes the entire next line of code and says type errors can never appear here. Nothing that goes wrong in this next line is fine. But then TS expect error, that does exactly the same thing, except that in the situation where there's no error on the next line, it will give you an error, right? So TS is expecting an error. It's asserting that on the next line there must be an error. And so when you let's say, for instance, that you have an issue with the package, right? A package is not exporting the stuff that it actually exports at runtime, right? And you do a TSIgnore on that. And what ends up happening is that package, eventually you update the dependency and it's all good. And now there's actually no error happening on the next line, but you've still got a TSIgnore above it. This is an issue because TSIgnore is a sledgehammer, right? It just destroys any type errors on the next line. It's not saying ignore a specific error or ignore this particular character or this set of characters. It's the entire next line. And so this is obviously dangerous. And so because you might have an error that you didn't expect on that next line. And then TS expect error, though, instead, when you update that dependency, when the error goes away, then you get a little flag saying, hey, there's no error here anymore. You can probably get rid of me. right? And I actually use TS expect error all the time in my courses because it's really useful for when you expect something to error. If it's not erroring, you'll get an error. God, it's
That's so
very
cool.
confusing,
Yeah.
but
So
you get the
it's
idea.
basically like a TS ignore, but it makes you clean up after yourself, because if there's no error, it's just like, get rid of me. There is no error here. Wow.
Exactly. Yeah, it's a TS ignore that basically
That's
cleans
incredible.
itself
Or
up
makes you
afterwards.
clean up after that. Thank you, man. I never knew that. So it yeah.
It is good, but I also think it's kind of crap in a way. There's a lot of people, and this is a common thing online, people saying, hey, yeah, you should use TS expect error instead of TS ignore, so Galaxy Brain. But the real thing here is that both of them are dangerous. Both of them are bad. I don't think you should use either of them in application code because they're sledgehammers. They target the entire next line. And so if you can do loads of weird shit underneath, or loads of weird stuff underneath a TS expect error, right? You can completely misspell something. You can just reference a variable that doesn't exist. You can have a faulty import. You can do anything. And so instead of all of them, you should probably be using as any. And there's no equivalent to TS expect error for as any. There's no as, I don't even know what that would be, as expect error or something. So why would I recommend that? Well, it's because as any targets a specific node, a specific thing. It's not destroying the entire next line. It's just targeting one thing. And usually that one thing is what you need to proceed. There are certain situations, of course, that you have to use TS ignore or TS expect error, but I would, where you can, not use them because they can cause a lot more errors than you think they're getting rid of.
As any and not as unknown?
Yeah. So unknown is, if we think of the difference between any and unknown is kind of like a legal type within the TypeScript type system. It's what's called the top type. It's the type that sits on top of the type system. Think of unknown at the top, you've got string and number and whatever, all the other types in the middle, and then never at the bottom. And we think of this as because you can pass string and number to unknown, but you can't pass anything to never. So you think of that sort of huge, great big structure. Any is kind of it's assignable to everything, and everything is assignable to it. It's kind of
right.
It just screws everything up, basically. And any is kind of like a TS ignore. It sort of disables type checking on itself, and it means you can do anything with it. So unknown is like a kind of a legal type, very sensible type, very wise, upstanding type. Any is like a mutant, disgusting, crazy type that sort of you can do anything with. And so if you need to get around TypeScript, you don't call the upstanding country lawyer, you call the hooligan, right? The destroyer of types.
Awesome. Wow, thank you. TypeScript is mature. I think would it be fair to say that it won against Flow back in the day? I think it won, right?
Yeah, I think so. There was a time when Flow was pretty competitive.
Right.
But
so since TypeScript has achieved sort of web dominance, how do you envision it evolving to address growing complexity? I mean, we have things like server components now, and it's I feel like, to be fair, front end is sort of stabilizing. I never thought this day would come, but earlier it was a new JavaScript library every week and so on. It's more stable now. However, complexity is growing. How do you think TypeScript will evolve in the coming months and years to keep up with that?
Yeah, how does it handle complexity is a great question. TypeScript is in a funny situation where with younger tools have to say, let's imagine that a new sort of linter comes out, right? On the day that linter comes out, in fact, Bun is a great example. So Bun is a JavaScript runtime, or TypeScript runtime actually, quite similar to Node, except it runs TypeScript. And on day one, Bun had support for JSX, right? So Bun on day one was supporting React and TypeScript. It was basically supporting these bigger things like this, these more established things. Whereas when a new runtime comes out, or let's say a new framework comes out. Let's imagine some new syntax, sort of like syntactical sugar like JSX gets added to JavaScript, something that TypeScript doesn't natively work with. It would probably have to say, we work with TypeScript. TypeScript wouldn't have to say, we work with this new fancy thing, right? And so TypeScript is now the dominant thing inside the ecosystem. And bugger, I've forgotten the
Oh no, it's fine. It's
question.
just how
So
would
sorry.
TypeScript
What was it?
evolve as complexity grows?
Yeah. So this complexity that's growing in the ecosystem, it's not really TypeScript's problem to solve, if that makes sense, or I don't think
Right.
it sees itself that way. If something becomes popular enough, let's say there's lots of file-based routing frameworks at the moment, right? And so in these file-based routing frameworks, what you do is you have a Remix is a great example where you can actually have files that have multiple parameters in the file name, right, that are sort of prefixed by a $sign, and then you have a function inside the file that has, let's say you export const loader, for instance, and that loader basically needs to understand what the parameters of that file name are. But TypeScript has no concept of like file names influencing types, right? Has no concept of that. And now TypeScript could add that, right? It could add that, and it could make sort of file-based routing more type safe, kind of like you would change the name of the file, and then it would sort of like go down to your types automatically. It totally could do that, right? That would be sick. All sorts of applications for that. You could do like .server.tsx. It would understand it was a server file, right? Really cool applications. But TypeScript doesn't really want to do that. It's got no incentive to do that, because what if file-based routing just turns out to be like a terrible idea? You know what I mean? And like the community turns against it, and then TypeScript has added this feature that no one then wants to use. And so TypeScript is pretty invested, I think, in just making itself better, sort of doing things that focus on itself and not adding new features willy-nilly, really. So yeah, it could, I think, embrace the complexity in the ecosystem a little bit, but there's no incentive for it to do
especially
so
because
at the moment, I don't think.
I love what you said, because if it adds support for things that are going to be outdated, then it becomes itself outdated. And so they've really got to toe the line on making sure that something is really sticky before they add support for it. And this is probably why it follows the ECMA 262, the JavaScript spec, because once something's in the JavaScript spec, it's in. Like, it never goes away. Let me ask the question a different way. What features or changes would you like to see in TypeScript to better support modern web development?
I think that, I would love that routing thing to be in there, because TypeScript's got all the information it needs to. I think there are many changes that would need to happen in terms of TypeScript compiler to make it work, but I would love to see it happen. I think my ideal future for TypeScript is that there's a huge amount of complexity in the tool chain that surrounds TypeScript, right? Because TypeScript itself, you've got to turn it into JavaScript files before you can run it, and that impacts all sorts of different things. It impacts Node, that sort of doesn't support TypeScript at the minute, or it supports it as of very, very recently, but under an experimental flag. Testing setups need to basically turn your TypeScript code into JavaScript before they can run it, and then create source maps to link them back and forth. When you're debugging your code, bloody hell, I tried setting up the VS Code debugger to work with TypeScript files the other day, and it was a nightmare. And, you've got all of this stuff and huge amount of ecosystem complexity just to handle the turning of TypeScript files into JavaScript files. What I would love is that if types were brought into JavaScript at some point. Now, this probably means, I don't think it means types at runtime, for instance, types influencing the V8 engine, types influencing making your code faster by optimizing them in memory or whatever. I don't even really understand that stuff. Like, the stuff that I would want is types that are ignored by the runtime, is types just kind of like TypeScript code as it is now. You would annotate a function, and you would be able to still run the TypeScript CLI on your code, except it would just sort of like be, and you'd still get the errors and things like that, but it would be JavaScript at runtime. And so we talked about the three heads of the dragon or whatever, and
Right.
3 heads of Cerberus, right? You're basically cutting off one of the heads. You basically just have the TypeScript CLI and the TypeScript language server, but you'd be working in JavaScript. That's my dream future. And it would, I think it would just decrease a lot of complexity in the ecosystem.
Approaching that personally, because over time, and I was one of the earlier adopters of TypeScript, over time, there's less and you could tell me if I'm speaking nonsense or if it's actually true. I see less and less requirement to explicitly annotate things with types. I don't actually write any explicit annotations anymore at all, unless I'm writing a function, in which case it has no way of doing an inference, right? So and so if your desire is let's write JavaScript and it just behaves like TypeScript, that's sort of the direction. Get rid of annotations altogether and somehow, I don't know, using AI or something, figure them out on the fly.
Yes. I think that you still need annotations, especially for function parameters, right? That's kind of like you're absolutely right. That's actually how I teach TypeScript too, is like just learn how to do function parameters and you're 90% of the way there, basically, because that's mostly what you're doing. And yeah, I mean, like there is a proposal to do what I described that was actually, when we met in JSConf Budapest, it was Gil Tyre, I think, who did a talk on this. And he spoke about this types as comments proposal. And what this proposal is to basically have types that are ignored by the runtime in TypeScript or in JavaScript. And this would be great. This would be so good for, and just decrease all that ecosystem.
I agree with that. We actually have once in a while an episode with the TC39 committee about things like signals and pipeline operators, and these things do come up quite often. So I'm happy to report that it's still being worked on and it's coming, although as most JavaScript features, it'll probably take a few years. Fantastic. I'd love to talk now about the other side of it. Thank you, by the way. It's such an incredible technical deep dive on TypeScript. Let's switch to the community side. I mean, you're an educator. Your work is so heavily based in community. I saw you tweet the other day about some milestone you reached on Twitter, or X, formerly known as Twitter. Where does that come from? Where did you? How? And maybe actually, let's start there. I've been doing tech for a while. I've been on tech Twitter for a while, and then one day I don't know from where your avatar started showing up, and there was always TypeScript content. I was like, who is this guy? Where did he come from? And now you're like everywhere, and you've written a book and you've created a course. How did that start? How did we get to where we are today?
Yeah, so it's funny to hear that. It did feel like it came very quickly, and it felt like I was answering some. Anyway, let's take it back. So I was a singing teacher, voice teacher, self-employed for about 6 years. I was doing that, and a long time I did that. I did a master's in it and stuff, and I ended up kind of moving like between 3 different places. So I started in a city called Exeter, moved to a city called Guildford for my master's, and then moved to London, and I had to basically set up 3 different businesses during that time. I had to set up one in Exeter, set up one in Guildford, set up one in London. And so I think if you were to examine me psychologically, you would find that I got very hungry doing that, and not mostly because I wasn't earning very much money doing that. And so I was self-employed. I had to work a lot of hours in order to do it, and I wasn't getting much back in terms of financial reward, So I kept on pressing, kept on having to do it, kept on finding ways to do it. And so I eventually got a job as a developer, and that's a story in itself. But when I became a developer, I was working full-time, and that little thing in my head kind of just switched off, this little ticking clock that I had. I must be earning money so I can eat and pay my massive London rent. Just turned off. I was living in Oxfordshire and living in the countryside and not needing to earn so much money, and I could go on holiday and they would pay me for going on holiday. What the hell? Incredible. And so that sort of feeling that I needed to work all the time it sort of died down a little bit. And I still was kind of bringing the self-employed intensity to the full-time job, which was quite a good combination, as it turns out. Because a lot of people, I think, who work in full-time jobs all the time don't have this this direct link between the amount of money they earn and the amount of time they put in, if that makes sense. Like, they're paid their salary every month, and that makes sense. And so what that meant then is when I went self-employed again, is I just hit it with the same energy as when I was working sort of for myself. But then I had this sort of 5-year rest of being a full-time developer. And so I was just ready to go, and I just smashed it out. And I was sort of getting some results. And I was working on XState at the time. So I'd worked at a few companies by that point. I sort of ended up startup hopping a little bit, and worked at this agency at the time that I was really happy with. And I was working as a lead developer, had a very small team, and we were shipping stuff. It was great. And then I started working on XState. And this is a big rambling story.
Okay, man, ramble.
This
is your episode. Yeah, go for it.
Ramble? Okay. And I was working on XState, and I started doing stuff in the community. So I started going on GitHub issues, trying to answer people's questions, started writing articles about XState. And I started getting good feedback. And I started feeling, there's something here. There's something that I can be a sort of teacher, do a bit of YouTube stuff, which I've been doing as a singing teacher anyway, and maybe feed that into getting some feedback here. And so I did that XState stuff for about 2 years, and I grew from, I think, like 400 followers on X or something to maybe 3,000, 4,000 or something. So I was that took a long time doing that stuff, just sort of slowly building that up in a community that ended up trusting me, ended up sort of paying attention to my videos when they came out. And that was really, really gratifying. And eventually I worked on XState full time and got hired as part of a company called Stately, which sort of was founded out of the XState core team. And then, as I briefly said before, we were doing a lot of complicated TypeScript on XState, because XState is a very complex library with state charts, state machines, needs complex TypeScript to describe it. And I posted a video on Twitter, and boom, I felt completely different energy, completely different feeling. It was just a video, no cuts, 2 minutes of me just doing some advanced TypeScript, solving a problem. And I thought, wow, okay, there's something here. And I've got a diary entry from that time as well, of like, I gained like 39 followers in like an hour or something, you know what I mean? It's crazy. And for me at the time, that felt crazy. And so I basically, one Sunday, I think, recorded about 12 of these and just queued them up. Just Monday, Wednesday, Friday, bam, 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 just me recording all these tips that I knew from working on XState. And it grew from like 4K to 10K or something very, very quickly. And from there, just felt the energy go. And I teamed up with Joel from Egghead. And yeah, it feels like I've just been riding a wave since then, really. And it feels like to me that the wave has crashed a little bit, which is an interesting feeling in itself. I've sort of been riding this wave up until until baby was born, actually. It feels, and just as baby was born, it feels like it's sort of like gone a bit more chill now. And so that's really from February 2022 is when I made that TypeScript tweet until January 2024. That's been this sort of crazy amount of energy has come my way, and I've become this TypeScript guy. People just started calling me that, and then other people started calling me that, and I think now people just sort of recommend me to their friends as the TypeScript guy, and I've just been focusing on TypeScript that entire time, not really talking about anything else. But now that the wave has crashed, or at least I feel it has, then it might be time to broaden horizons, might be time to talk about something else.
How do you feel about this wave crashing? Do you feel like you're not as relevant? Does it bum you out? Or does it give you respite? Or you're like, oh my goodness, finally I can breathe a little bit.
I mean, I think perhaps, this sort of is very subjective, right? It's like I'm noticing something. Maybe I'm noticing that the platform that's my primary outlet, which is Twitter, is behaving differently. I'm not getting quite so much traction as I used to. Or I'm maybe maxing out an audience, right? I might have found all of the developers that are interested in my stuff. That's fine too. I feel immensely grateful for everything that's happened to me so far. You know what I mean? I'm not sure how I could feel anything else. And being able to go full time on this and being able to, what this has materially done for me is I've been able to spend like the last 6 months just hanging out with my son. You know what I mean? Not done it. I mean, sure, in that time I did edit a book and launch a course and that sort of thing, but it's been a lot less working hours than it would have been. And so I cannot be, how can I feel churlish about that? You know, like it's been insane. And it feels like there are more opportunities out there for me. It's not just TypeScript, I think.
Interesting. So you're a real hustler in a sense. And I bring this. By the way, just to clarify, I don't mean hustler as in like this. This means thief. I don't mean it in that. English is a funny language. By hustle, I mean like you do a lot. And this is interesting because I saw this like exchange between you and Kent Dodds, also former guest on the podcast, recently on X, where you guys were like disagreeing about hustle culture. And you were on the side of, hustle culture it's really bad because it can encourage you to put your humanity aside and just go. But it sounds like now after hearing this, you do that. You've done that, like from being a music teacher and working 3 businesses, and then you mentioned you got this job and you're like, oh, this is too easy, so I'm gonna do more. It's interesting to hear that. So it sounds like, if I can venture a extrapolation, that hustle culture is good, as long as you can, of course, balance it or manage it towards a good outcome, like spending time with your family, your son. Would that be fair? I mean, I'm trying to extract takeaways for listeners. Like, should they hustle? Meaning, here, let's make it really practical. I have a full-time job, a 40-hour week. I'm a developer relations engineer at DataStax, and it does all the things you mentioned when you had a job, right? Like, I get paid for vacation. I get to work 40 hours a week and then spend time with my family. I have no real reason to sort of hustle. The podcast, I do it as education. It's a labor of love. It's not so much for like money. So I guess the question I'm trying to ask is it seems to have been valuable for you to go the extra mile when you were working a job, to now also continue. You're still self-employed. Yeah, so I guess let's just finally put a question to my ramble, which is, what is the role of hustle? How should one approach it to maximize happiness? What's worked for you?
Yeah, I find it hard to answer that question because you're right. I do have a history of working hard to achieve things, I suppose, or working hard. But at the time, when I was hustling, let's say, I was really just trying to, it felt, instead of like I was hustling to get a better life or something, or hustling to move up, it felt like I was hustling just to get stay level, right? Yeah, really. Or just to achieve the baseline of a successful business. I was trying to, so I would be very careful with my spreadsheets and stuff. I would try to meet these financial goals, which would be literally just like earn as much as I would be earning if I was, let's say, working as a teacher. Let's say, I was not aiming high, let's say. And all of that time, I knew that there was some version of a future where I could end up earning more while working less, right? I knew that, and that has always been my goal, is to basically work at as high a leverage as possible. So to develop skills that mean that I can earn a lot of money or enough money without working very much. And that's basically where I'm living now. Like that is, I'm living that goal. And that took me a long time to be able to achieve that. And so my goal in hustling, I suppose, was never to work more. It's always to work less. And I've just, being able to achieve that has been something that I never thought I would actually do. I never thought I would actually reach this milestone. But it feels like I have now, which is insane. And I can't quite get my head around it still. And it sort of plays with me in funny ways too. I want to, especially because I have this, commitment that I've always wanted a family, always wanted a baby, and now I have it and it's wonderful. And now I need to think, How much time do I want to spend with him versus how much time do I actually need to commit to working? At what point do we have childcare? All of these decisions factor into it. And also, I kind of want to go back to full-time work. Actually, I kind of just want to turn that thing off again because it was real nice when I did that, and I really would like to do that at some point. I'd love to go back to being an engineer. I'd love to work on a team again.
This is, I guess, we started this discussion by sort of acknowledging and low-key like marveling about the fact that we're both two sides of a similar coin. I will say this: I was independent. So in 2023, I did run a DevRel consultancy, and of course, it didn't it wasn't as successful as, well, maybe it was. I don't know. Like in terms of pure numbers and followership, probably not as you, but it was very, very lucrative, put it that way. But indeed, I was also working way too hard to the point where when my family would send me a message like, hey, I need your help making a decision, I would often respond with, oh my gosh, why another decision? Don't you know I'm super busy with this? Why don't you figure it out yourself? And it was so interesting because they were like added stress as opposed to the first priority because I was working so hard. And maybe you can relate. And this was where I did see tremendous success running this thing, but also it really messed with my priorities in a way that number one wasn't number one. So like if I had a son, a baby, this baby would have been like, oh my gosh, he's crying again. Why don't you, instead of like, oh my gosh, this is my son. So the perspective was very skewed. And so then I got this full-time position where I'm at now. And I can tell you this, it works absolute wonders for balance. Kent Dodds in his episode on the podcast said, somebody asked him, how do you manage your work-life balance between Epic Web and all your work plus having 5 children, and a family? And Kent said, no, there's no balance. Like everything I do for work feeds the family. They come first and only. And I thought this was really cool. In any case, the reason I bring all of this up is I just want to agree with your desire for full-time work. It has been really good for me, but I am like you in that I also feel somewhat entrepreneurial. I like starting businesses and being self-employed and so on. And I watched recently Deadpool and Wolverine, and in this movie there was this quote that hit me really, really hard, where Deadpool says, he's like, look at Denmark. They're not going to put anyone on the moon, but man, they're so happy. And I was like, that's. Am I okay with that? Am I okay with like just being happy while not really moving, the world forward or doing something big? And I don't know. I'm curious if at all that's relatable to you, and if you had to wrestle with similar things.
So this is quite cheesy, but I remember writing in my journal, like when I was, 19 or something, or 20. I remember writing some kind of like 5 C's or something, that I needed to achieve a different C in like various, like a point in my life or something. And so I can't remember all of them, but I remember the first 2, which is competence and compassion. So I knew that like in my 20s, I feel like I had to be competent at something. I had to get good at something. And if I was competent enough at something, then I would be able to like earn money doing this, increase my leverage in working and that kind of thing. But then in your 30s, as long as you've achieved the first thing, then you can move on to the second thing, which is actually developing empathy, being compassionate. And in order, because if you need that, if you're going to be a good parent, right? I always knew I wanted to be a parent, and you do need that in huge amounts, and it's something you got to work on and something you got to make sense of. And so that was always my thinking. And I think hustle culture, to come back to your original point, it just focuses on the first one. It's just all about competence. There is no room for compassion, and you're right, it skews with your priorities. And if you don't have, the compassion, then you're screwed, because you just keep on. You can use that justification that everything I do feeds my family, right? But actually, if you're not spending time, like you can do that to a point where you just don't spend time with your family anymore, right? You go and work off on the mental oil rig, and you stay in your study all the time, and you work till 4 a.m. and that wasn't a road I wanted to go down. And I think that hustle culture, the sort of the TikTok version of this, would say, work 16 hours a day, don't stop, fit your family in where you can, but everything you're doing is for them. You know what I mean? Yeah, it's not something I can agree with.
I'm happy about that. So in your mind, getting a full-time job would have this upper bound of time, meaning, look, it's time boxed. I'm doing my 9 to 5, whatever it may be, and then it's all family all the time, quality time too, not just quantity. Is that sort of the thinking behind it?
Yeah. Yeah, and as well, my work does bleed into my life. Really, there isn't really a work-life balance at the minute in terms of that everything is life, right? I'm struggling to fit in work, really. So when baby is sleeping, I'll sometimes work for 45 minutes, doing a bit of book editing, doing a bit of something. And it's really tricky in these conversations because I find it so hard to extrapolate lessons from my own life. You know what I mean? I find that really hard. Maybe it's like a British thing that I don't want to, probably a normal, be prescriptive or say that my lessons are in any way comparable to yours, because we all have different lives, and we all start from different places and we end up in different places and we all have different motivations. But I do think there's something odd about a culture that prescribes that work is the only thing that matters.
I think the bigger problem that the culture has is that they don't know. I think in tech, I would love to get your take on this, actually, because for me, I've been in tech since I was 8 years old. I started with Prince of Persia, and I was like, oh, how's this game made? And I have you're not even going to believe this, but I have a physical diploma signed by the dean of some institute that gives me a honors diploma in object-oriented C++. And the date on this thing is 2003. Wow. I was 10 years old. And so I've literally this has been my entire life. My nervous system has wrapped around a computer, And so for me, I never really had to think about, what am I going to do in the future? Where is my passion? I always knew it was code. And so in many ways, the career I have today is it just happened. It was almost like an inevitability of the universe. But I think not everybody has this. I mean, I wonder if you even had it, because you were doing music teaching. You were all over the place, as I imagine a lot of maybe even the listeners here sometimes are. Is this my passion? Is this going to be my job? And I see this a lot with people finishing maybe high school, going to university. I ask them, what are you going to study? They say, I don't know, business. And they don't really know what that means, management, right? So I wonder if there's this sort of passion crisis, I don't know what to do, that then feeds into this hustle, but the hustle is really just running around in circles and chasing the wind because you just don't know what you want to do. So I'm curious to dig into that in your context. Specifically, you said you even did a master's in music. That would have taken 5 years if you combine that with undergrad. Just a year. But was the undergrad also in music?
So the undergrad was in drama, actually. So I was one of these people, I know, one of these people who just sort of left school not really knowing what I wanted to do. I knew that I had felt good doing A-level drama, and A-level being a thing in the UK. I'm not sure if it is overseas. And I'd felt good doing that. I'd felt comfortable in those classes. And so I just went into the university course in it. I got there, immediately realized I was never going to be an actor or anything like that, or because everyone else there was better than me. And so I sort of decided, okay, I was in a few bands at university, and I sang and wrote some songs and stuff. And I thought, maybe I could do that, And so I never had this sort of feeling of this is what I must do, Oddly enough, my story of becoming a singing teacher it sort of involves tech in a funny way. My friend was running a business where, my long-term friend, and this business was basically what this would have been 2010, he would get domain names to the top of Google for various music teaching things. So he had singinglessonsexter.com, and he would put a load of content up there and put a fake teacher up there, and then he would find a teacher in the local area and say, would you like to take this website off me? I'll get a bit of your singing students every month. And he couldn't find one for Exeter, and so he said, you're a singer, right? You want to just take a couple of students while we're waiting, at university? And I just did it, and I liked it. And so eventually that morphed into right, I want to be the best singing teacher in the world or something. You know, I've started feeding my passion into it, I suppose. I found something I liked and I just kept on doing it. And so that ended up being, okay, what's the next step? Well, I want to make sure that what I'm teaching is correct, so I'll go and do a master's in it. And got a master's from Guildford School of Acting. Then I moved to London because that's where all the best singing teachers are. Worked in drama schools. I was also an acting coach as well, so taught Shakespeare and taught all sorts of stuff. Expanded out my palette and all that kind of thing. And I just kept on doing what I was doing as hard as I could possibly do it, basically. I suppose, is this hustle culture? It's kind of just like finding something you love and really hammering at it. I wasn't doing it for money. I was just sort of struggling to stay afloat, but living relatively comfortably, but, not making megabucks. And I wanted to then, I basically didn't like London. So I was sick of living in London, and I'd always liked coding, which is, I remember when I was like 11 years old, writing out the HTML tags by hand and like making little websites for my friends and stuff. And I thought I was writing apps for my students as well at the time. So I made little web apps to make my lessons better. Because again, want to make things better, want to continually improve. And then I was actually traveling with my wife, or now wife, and in Bangkok airport at 6 a.m., I started looking at job listings in the UK. And I go, oh, well, I know a bit of CSS. I could probably learn Sass or whatever they were using at the time. I know React a little. Oh, yeah, I could learn this, and started just listing out all the tools I might need to learn. And so learning to code was a way of getting out of London.
So you're self-taught with code. Wow.
Yeah.
So it sounds like indeed your early hustle to stay afloat came from also just not knowing what you wanted to do, what you were supposed to do. But what you mentioned it really stuck with me was you said you wanted to be the very best at singing teaching. Just like this guy asked you, he's like, you're a singer, can you be a teacher? And you said yes. But then you specifically mentioned you wanted to be the very best. I can relate to that because I also, if I learn something vaguely, I'm not comfortable with this. I have to be like very, very good at it. I think one example of this is like physical health. I spend way too much time this morning, literally spent like an hour looking into respiratory rate as a measure of recoveredness from exercise. And again, like on all the journals and all of this. Where does that I think this is something that a lot of the listeners would want to know, right? Where does that come from? Some people, coding is just a means to an end. I don't really care. It's just something I do to get money, which is also super valid. But I can't help but feel or believe that some people, they want to have that drive, but they can't. They feel blocked. They don't know how. Where did that come from for you?
It's a good question. And I wonder whether it's a useful thing to have, first of all. I think I have a tendency to sort of, again, this might be a British thing, but sort of do down my own, what people might consider my positive attributes. I wonder whether this was a useful concept for me to have in mind. It wasn't necessarily something like, oh, I'm going to be ruined if I don't become the best singing teacher in the world, or if I don't make the top 8 or whatever that even means. It's not like there's a World Cup. So I think, in terms of coding, I knew because I was coming in late, because I was, 25 or something when I started learning to code. I knew that I was never going to be one of the world's best. I knew that I had a disadvantage. And I guess what you're asking, though, is about mastery, right? It's about the feeling
drive
of getting better
for
and
mastery,
better.
exactly.
Yeah, and the desire for it, like why it's fun, I suppose, to pursue this stuff. And at the time, in fact, in both cases, this is the answer. In both cases, it didn't feel like I was pursuing an enlightened goal. It didn't feel like I was going for something because it was a beautiful holistic goal that I will reach someday, and it'll be wonderful, and it's great for me to do. It was kind of a fear that there were singing teachers locally that were better than me, and that because I'd sort of gone into it late, really, I didn't have any sort of background in singing teaching like myself. Like, I needed to do it in order to just meet the base level of competency. You know what I mean? I needed to, and that morphed into basically what I mean to say is I wanted to be the best singing teacher in my area, right? Or at least better than the people that I knew. And so that meant I read books and I, went and did courses and all that sort of stuff. And then coding was exactly the same. Because coding, I felt like, what? You've got no background in this whatsoever. What are you doing coming into tech? Like, you've got no business here. It's a kind of imposter syndrome in a way, but it's an imposter syndrome that drove me to absolutely consume as much as I could possibly consume, and actually drove me to Twitter too. So it meant I remember cycling to my work, listening to the Syntax podcast, just like hungry for everything that they were dropping, because I knew that I needed to do it. It's not like, and I think if you have that fear of not being good enough or not being worthy of being in the room that you're in, turn that into hunger. I mean, and if you can, like, that's how it came up in me. I was determined to meet the base level of competency, and once I'd got there, that energy was enough to get me to a better spot pretty quickly. Like, I went from junior to mid to senior to lead pretty fast, I think over the course of like 3 years or something, just because that same terror of not being good enough was driving me the whole time. And that's not necessarily something I'd recommend to everyone, right? That was just the path that happened to take.
Again, highly relatable for me because I had almost a similar experience where, yes, I've been doing code since I was a kid. A lot of it alone, never in teams. My first job in a proficient team was almost the same as you. I got, and the tech industry has come a long way in terms of being welcoming nowadays, because back then, this is 2014, 2015, there was a lot of who wrote this garbage code, who wrote this Indian code, and they could see my name. So there was a lot of, who wrote this Indian code, and you don't belong on this team. You're worse than a junior. We shouldn't have hired you. I would literally go home from work crying multiple times a month, and so the imposter syndrome was there, but it was also amplified by my teammates, exactly as you mentioned. And I was like, oh man, I am super useless. But that drive, that's where the drive came from. It was this rejection almost. And I 100% relate to you, where I still remember I read out of fear. I read You Don't Know JavaScript by Kyle Simpson, also a guest on the podcast, and a friend of mine today, absolutely bananas. But I read this book and leveled up to the point where I felt, okay, I kind of have this. And then just it started to feel good, like learning and getting validation, and then you go more and more. And I think that's the key. And so this is really interesting for me because it's casting a different valence on imposter syndrome and fear, right? Like we spend most of our lives being told this stuff is bad, avoid it. You're not an imposter, you're welcome. Here's a gold star. And while all of that has its place, it can also be extremely motivating depending on mindset. So incredible. Thank you for sharing that.
And combined with that too, what I found when I was a singing teacher is that the further I moved up in that world, when I was starting out, this was like my first job, really. My first job was like being a singing teacher, learning about other singing teachers. I saw these people, even that were the step above me, as gods, right? As incredible geniuses that had all this background that I didn't have, that had this years of instinct kind of built up from, let's say their parents have been singing teachers, generational knowledge sort of packed in. And I would go and have lessons with these people, and they'd be okay.
Yes.
You know what I mean? Like it would be they would be all right. They would be unfocused maybe, or like not necessarily paying attention. They weren't gods, they're just people. I go up to the next rung, still just people, again and again and again and again. And so oddly, when I went into tech, I was prepared for that. I knew that, sure, these are just people working these jobs, you know what I mean? And so I knew that because I'd already done that step up once. And so doing it a second time, it felt like I was speedrunning it in a way, because I knew the psychology behind it. And so that's really important too, is that, these the people that are above you,
or that you perceive to be far above you, they may not even be above you. It's just you build them up to be these things in your mind, right?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And they're not. They're just people. And often you can get to their level. Like I never dreamed that. Imagine me looking at Kent C. Dodds a few years ago and thinking, right, I would be relatively at his level, sort of like selling a course with the same people that he uses. Like having a relatively similar respect in a different field. You know what I mean? Like, what? But he's just a dude. You know what I mean? He's just a guy. Like, and they're all just people, like on Twitter. And so you take away some of the marks of legitimacy, let's say, or some of you take Guillermo Rauch out of the office of Vercel, and he's just a dude wandering around. Like there's this Michel de Montaigne quote. I really want to get this right, but it's something like, "All the kings in all the world are seated upon their asses."
That's awesome. Yeah,
they're just there, right? They've got the same physical characteristics as you. All you need to do is maybe work just a touch harder, feel the hunger, and you'll be fine.
I love that. And also feel the imposter syndrome. Let it motivate you. I'll tell you this, I was an imposter. And it was my awareness of my own imposterness that helped me not be an imposter. I think the great Amy Cuddy from Princeton University has a TED Talk about it, where she says, don't fake it till you make it, fake it till you become it. You will become it if you give enough attention and effort. So on that note, listen, Matt, it's been unbelievable having you here on both capacities, as an expert, as a world expert TypeScript instructor, but also just as a friend and as somebody who is definitely not an imposter. You've contributed so much. And to hear you as someone who is self-taught, who felt this imposter syndrome, who built up people like Orta Theroux to be some type of god, to now speak about TypeScript as confidently and as accurately as you have, I think is a testament and encouragement to anybody listening who wants to follow in your footsteps. So on behalf of me and all the listeners, thank you so much for coming on the podcast and sharing all of this with us today. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you so much, Tejas. It's been a joy.
Thank you for joining my discussion with Matt Pocock. If you've been using TypeScript, I hope you see it now in a different way and have skills that are enhanced that you can go use daily at work. If you're new to TypeScript, I hope you now see the value of TypeScript and why it's honestly a superior language to JavaScript and many others out there. If you are a content creator and you want to grow your audience and have reach like Matt does, well, I hope you can do that now. I hope you have some tools you've learned. In any case, if you're learning from and or enjoying this content, then a great way to support it at no cost, if you're watching on YouTube, is to like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. If you're listening on Apple and Spotify, I keep saying and or. If you're listening on Apple or Spotify, then if you leave up to a 5-star review on this platform, that's a great way to support it with really no cost to you. Of course, if you share any of this on social media, that would also be a great help. The name of the game is to make this discoverable and accessible to as many people as possible, because honestly, people did that for me, and I'd like to be able to do that for others. And so that's why we do this. So again, if you make this accessible and discoverable, people win. One final thing is, if all of the content we covered today is searchable. So if you heard like a word, if you heard like TS error, TS expect any, whatever it may be, TS expect error or TS ignore, then what you can do is go to the podcast website, that's tej.as/podcast, and just type it in. And what you'll find is you'll be taken to the moment in time where we cover that in this episode, but also episodes with other people where we may have talked about those. It's a great way to, again, make this content more discoverable and accessible. That's the name of the game. So I hope I've given you enough by ways of making it discoverable and also discovering it yourself. Hey, thanks so much for sticking around. Thanks for being a part of the podcast. And most importantly, thank you for your interest in engineering.